So the first paragraph of the essay, again, is called the introduction. And the introduction, the introductory paragraph, has a hook, a link, and a thesis. We already talked about the thesis because that's usually what you plan first when you're planning your essay, when you're organizing it. Then my advice after that is to figure out what you're going to use for your hook. The point of the hook, the exclusive point, is to engage your reader, to make your reader want to read the essay. So the one criterion that I want you to think about the most when you're choosing a hook, when you're writing a hook, is this interesting? Will it surprise my reader? Will my reader be intrigued by what I've included in my hook? So I don't want you to think that it has to be exactly what your thesis is going to be about. What's more important is that it's interesting. There are many different kinds of hooks, but I'm going to give you the 4 that I think are the easiest to use and the easiest to understand. So the first hook that we're going to talk about is a fact or a statistic. And you'll have to do typically some research to be able to come up with that kind of a hook. The second common kind of hook is using a quotation, so using someone else's words that are interesting, that are engaging, again, because that's what you're looking for in your hook. The third kind is posing a question to your reader. You want to come up with something that might surprise them or might be interesting to them instead of just a boring question, which I think is one of the hard parts about writing a good question hook. Oftentimes they're just a little bit simplistic. And then the final hook to talk about is a definition, defining a term or a concept in an interesting or intriguing way. Okay, so these 1, 2, 3, 4 are 4 common kinds of hooks. So what I'm going to do now is give you an example of each one that is about technology, because that's the pretend essay that we're writing. So an example of a fact or statistic about technology is, according to an article in a British publication, The Independent, as of 2014, gadgets, so technological devices, outnumber people. So that is a fact or statistic I found, that as of 2014, the world had more gadgets and devices than it did people. So I think that's surprising and interesting about technology, which again is what I'm trying to do with my hook, come up with something that will make my reader want to keep reading. Okay, so that's an example of a fact hook. Now I'm going to give you an example of a quotation hook, which is another kind you can use. So, and you'll see this is also about technology. The famous American architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, once said, and I'm going to use his exact words, which is what a quotation is. It's using someone's exact words. If it keeps up, man will atrophy. I'll tell you what that means in a moment. All his limbs, but the push button finger. Atrophy means when your muscles wear away, when they lose all of their strength, when they lose all of their form. So when you're using a quote, tell me who said it. Tell me who that person is, unless it's really obvious, like Albert Einstein or someone that everybody knows. And then introduce exactly what the person says. So in this case, he's making the point that we use technology so much throughout the entire day that the only thing we're using anymore is our finger to push a button. So that's what's important with this hook. It should be interesting. A quotation needs to tell me who said it and who that person is. Coming back to the fact or statistic, if you use that kind of a hook, Tell me where you found the fact or statistic. And later we'll talk about how you properly cite this source and give credit to it. But at this point, you just need to tell me where you found that information that you're doing. Okay, so the 4 kinds of hooks are fact or statistic, quotation, question, and definition. So now I want to give you examples of these final 2, coming up with a question or posing the definition, the meaning of a word or concept that you'll cover in your essay. So let me give you an example of a question hook that you might write, again, using this topic of technology. So I have technology now seems to touch every aspect of our lives. And stretch to every corner of the world. And then here's my question. But do these innovations always indicate progress? So it's a question about technology, and I want to set up the idea that technology is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's in every part of the world. Everyone has access to it. But the question I want to pose to my reader is this necessarily a good thing? Do these changes, do these creations necessarily mean progress? So these first 2 hooks are probably my favorite ones because it's easy to find some that are interesting, that are engaging. The problem with these 2 is you have to do a little bit of research to come up with them. You can't usually have a fact or statistic or a quotation if you're just sitting there writing an essay on the spot. The question, on the other hand, you can come up with off the top of your head. That's the advantage of this kind of hook. The problem is it can be really hard to write one that's interesting. And what my students often do is just throw the question I've given them as a prompt back out as a hook. So if I've asked them, does technology make people lazy? Then that's what they use as a hook. But that's not a very interesting question. So it's a good hook to use because you can come up with it on your own. The problem, the downside, what you want to be cautious about is that you're not writing a really boring question. That what you're writing is interesting and engaging because that is the sole purpose of the hook. Okay, definition is similar to the question in that you can come up with your own definition of something. Or you can do research to find an exact definition. But with this one, the problem can be, it might be a little bit boring. So you don't want to define something that's obvious, like what a table is or a shirt. You want to define something that's more abstract that could potentially have more than one definition. So let me give you an example hook to try to make that point. So for example, and I looked up the exact definition. So if you do that, tell me your source. Progress is the term I'm defining. Progress can be defined as, and here is the exact definition, a movement toward a goal or to a further or higher stage. End quote. Forgive me, I forgot the end quote when I gave you this hook. You always, when you're quoting something, need to show where the quotation begins and where it ends. So this is not a quotation hook. It's not what somebody said. The reason I have quotation marks is because these are the exact words that were used in the dictionary. What I like about this definition is I think it's an interesting definition, this idea of progress moving someone to a further or higher stage. Please notice I haven't even used the word technology in this hook. That's on purpose because I couldn't find a definition of technology that was that interesting. I think this definition of progress is interesting. So I would go from that hook to then writing about technology and then coming back to the idea of whether or not technology shows progress or whether it's causing us to become lazy or causing us to have disadvantages. So your introduction is composed of a hook, a link, and a thesis. You plan the thesis first, but the first part of your introduction, the first thing your reader will see is that hook. And the point of it is to engage your reader, to interest your reader, and to make your reader want to keep reading into the link and the thesis, and then ultimately the body paragraphs and the conclusion. Okay, we've talked about the thesis, we've talked about the hook. All that's left is for me to explain what the link is and how to compose it.